Chapter 2 of The Log of a Cowboy by Andy Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Receiving. It was a nice 10-day trip from San Antonio to the Rio Grande River. We made 25 to 30 miles a day, giving the saddle horses all the advantage of grazing on the way. Rather than hobble, Forrest night herded them, using 5 guards, 2 men to the watch of 2 hours each. "As I have little hope of ever rising to the dignity of foreman," said our segundo while arranging the guards, "I'll take this occasion to show you varmints what an iron will I possess. With the amount of help I have, I don't propose to even catch a night horse, and I'll give the cook orders to bring me a cup of coffee and a cigarette before I arise in the morning. I've been up the trail before and realize that this authority is short-lived, so I propose to make the most of it while it lasts. Now, all of you know your places, and see you don't incur your foreman's displeasure." The outfit reached Brownsville on March 25th, where we picked up Flood and Lovell, and dropping down the river about 6 miles below Fort Brown, went into camp at a cattle ford known as Paso Ganado. The Rio Grande was 200 yards wide at this point, and at its then stage was almost swimming from bank to bank. It had very little current, and when winds were favorable the tide from the Gulf ran in above the ford. Flood had spent the past 2 weeks across the river, receiving and road branding the herd, so when the cattle should reach the river on the Mexican side, we were in honor bound to accept everything bearing the circle dot on the left hip. The contract called for 1,000 she cattle, 3 and 4 years of age, and 2,000 4 and 5-year-old beeves, estimated as sufficient to fill a £1,000,000 beef contract. For fear of losses on the trail, our foreman had accepted 50 extra head of each class, and our herd at starting would number 3,100 head. They were coming up from ranches in the interior, and we expected to cross them at the first favorable day after their arrival. A number of different rancheros had turned in cattle in making up the herd, and Flood reported them in good, strong condition. Lovell and Flood were a good team of cowmen. The former, as a youth, had carried a musket in the ranks of the Union Army, and at the end of that struggle cast his fortune with Texas. Where others had seen nothing but the desolation of war, Lovell saw opportunities of business, and had yearly forged ahead as a drover and a beef contractor. He was well calculated to manage the cattle business, but was irritable and inclined to borrow trouble, therefore unqualified personally to oversee the actual management of a cow herd. In repose, Don Lovell was slow, almost dull, but in an emergency was astonishing quick-witted and alert. He never insisted on temperance among his men, and though usually of a placid temperament, when out of tobacco, oh Lord. Jim Flood, on the other hand, was in 100 respects the antithesis of his employer. Born to the soil of Texas, he knew nothing but cattle, but he knew them thoroughly. Yet in their calling, the pair were a harmonious unit. He never crossed a bridge till he reached it, and was indulgent with his men, and would overlook any fault so long as they rendered faithful service. Priest told me this incident. Flood had hired a man at Red River the year before, when a self-appointed guardian present called Flood to one side and said, "Don't you know that the man you just hired is the worst drunkard in this country?" "No, I didn't know it," replied Flood, "but I'm glad to hear he is. I don't want to ruin an innocent man, and a trail outfit is not supposed to have any morals. Just so the herd count doesn't shy on the day of delivery, I don't mind how many drinks the outfit takes." The next morning after going into camp, the first thing was the allotment of our mounts for the trip. Flood had the first pick, and cut 12 bays and browns. His preference for solid colors, though they were not the largest in the remuda, showed his practical sense of horses. When it came the boys' turn to cut, we were only allowed to cut one at a time by turns, even casting lots for the first choice. We had ridden the horses enough to have a fair idea as to their merits, and every lad was his own judge. There were, as it happened, only 3 pinto horses in the entire saddle stock, and these 3 were the last left of the entire bunch. Now a little boy or girl, and many an older person, thinks that a spotted horse is the real thing, but practical cattlemen know that this freak of color in ranged bred horses is the result of in and in breeding, with consequent physical and mental deterioration. It was my good fortune that morning to get a good mount of horses: 3 sorrels, 2 grays, 2 coyotes, a black, a brown, and a grulla. The black was my second pick, and though the color is not a hardy one, his breadbasket indicated that he could carry food for a long ride, and he ought to be a good swimmer. My judgment of him was confirmed throughout the trip, as I used him for my night horse, and when we had swimming rivers to ford. I gave this black the name of Nigger Boy. For the trip each man was expected to furnish his own accoutrements. In saddles we had the ordinary Texas make, the housings of which covered our mounts from withers to hips, and would weigh from 30 to 40 pounds, bedecked with the latest in the way of trimmings and trappings. Our bridles were in keeping with the saddles, the reins as long as plow lines, while the bit was frequently ornamental and costly. The indispensable slicker, a greatcoat of oiled canvas, was ever at hand, securely tied to our cantle strings. Spurs were a matter of taste. If a rider carried a quirt, he usually dispensed with spurs, though, when used, those with large, dull rowels were the make commonly chosen. In the matter of leggings, not over half our outfit had any, as a trail herd always kept in the open, and except for night herding, they were too warm in the summer. Our craft never used a cattle whip, but if emergency required, the loose end of a rope served instead, and was more humane. Either Flood or Lovell went into town every afternoon with some of the boys, expecting to hear from the cattle. On one trip they took along the wagon, laying in a month's supplies. The rest of us amused ourselves in various ways. One afternoon, when the tide was in, we tried our swimming horses in the river, stripping to our underclothing, and, with nothing but a bridle on our horses, plunged into tide water. My Nigger Boy swam from bank to bank like a duck. On return, I slid off behind and taking his tail, let him tow me to our side, where he arrived snorting like a tugboat. One evening on their return from Brownsville, Flood brought word that the herd would camp that night within 15 miles of the river. At daybreak, Lovell and the foreman, with Fox, Quarternight, and myself, started to meet the herd. The nearest ferry was at Brownsville, and it was 11 o'clock when we reached the cattle. Flood had dispensed with an interpreter and had taken Quarternight and me along to do the interpreting. The cattle were well shed and in good flesh for such an early season of the year, and in receiving, our foreman had been careful and had accepted only such as had the strength for a long voyage. They were the long-legged, long-horned southern cattle, pale colored as a rule, possessed the running power of a deer, and in an ordinary walk could travel with a horse. They had about 30 vaqueros under a corporal driving the herd, and the cattle were strung out in regular trailing manner. We rode with them until the noon hour, when, with the understanding that they were to bring the herd to Paso Ganado by 10 o'clock the following day, we rode for Matamoros. Lovell had other herds to start on the trail that year, and was very anxious to cross the cattle the following day, so as to get the weekly steamer, the only mode of travel, which left Port Isabel for Galveston on the 1st of April. The next morning was bright and clear, with an east wind, which ensured a flood tide in the river. On first sighting the herd that morning, we made ready to cross them as soon as they reached the river. The wagon was moved up within 100 yards of the ford, and a substantial corral of ropes was stretched. The entire saddle stock was driven in, so as to be at hand in case a hasty change of mounts was required. By this time Honeyman knew